We're actually born with a possible mindset. This thing that I teach, this empowered way of thinking, this limitless belief in limitless possibilities. We're born with that. But society, unfortunately, and the sort of societal norms and the pressures and the setbacks and the growing fear and anxiety and the dinging of our phones actually trains that out of us. I'm not actually teaching you about something you don't know about. I'm just reteaching you. I'm refamiliarizing you with something that you were innately came into this planet with, which is there are limitless possibilities in front of us in every step of the way.
Hey there, Jeff Lerner here. Welcome to Unlock Your Potential. Just had an incredible conversation with a gentleman named Colin O'Brady, who you're going to get to hear more from in just a moment. This gentleman has done some incredible things that really illustrate the limits or the limitlessness, I should say, of our potential. For perspective, I don't want to give away all the great tidbits from the show, but Colin has done some incredible things in mountaineering, setting world records, things like rowing a boat across Drake Passage near Antarctica, walking across the entire continent of Antarctica, pulling his own sled. He's climbed all the tallest mountains. He's climbed Everest twice. But it's not really just a conversation about great exploits. I think it's a conversation about the heart and the mind and the soul and remembering how to be a child, like we all are deep inside, if we allow ourselves to be. You're going to get to hear some pretty funny anecdotes. He stumped a room full of billionaires with a super awkward question. He carries a pebble around in his pocket. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce to you my conversation with Colin O'Brady here on Unlock Your Potential. Enjoy. Who were you before you were this like crazy adventurous outdoor person, and how did you become this crazy adventurous outdoor person?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. I was actually born on a hippie commune in Olympia, Washington, with on a futon. Apparently there was 30 or 40 people there, my mom's friends hanging out, celebrating a baby being born, playing Bob Marley, and hanging out in the 80s. So,
right.
That's
is that on the Olympic Peninsula? That's like rainforest?
No, it's kind of the center of the state. It's the capital of the state there.
Okay.
But not too far away from the Olympic Peninsula. You can see Mount Rainier, and that's a beautiful area. I only lived there for 9 months. Don't remember it. But then I grew up in Portland, Oregon. So grew up in Portland, Oregon. And yeah, I was an athletic kid. I swam and played soccer at a pretty high level, swam in college. But got introduced to the outdoors through my dad, really, my parents. The Pacific Northwest is a great place. If you love the outdoors. We didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid. But my dad always used to say, the outdoors are free, so we, most of our weekends were spent, driving 30 minutes outside of the city to a trailhead or a state park or going for a hike or a backpack or something like that. So definitely instilled in the beauty of the outdoors, not necessarily ever imagining that I would, climb Everest a couple times and walk across Antarctica and row a boat across Drake Passage and the various other, big adventurous exploits around the world that I've done. But definitely just had a passion for the outdoors just in my own backyard.
So when did it, you were a college athlete, you said you swam?
Yep.
And where'd you go to school? I remember reading it. Was it Yale or?
Yeah, I went to Yale. Yeah.
Yale.
Okay.
Yale.
Yep.
So do I offend somebody at Yale when I go, was it Yale? Was it Princeton?
No, that doesn't offend me at all. Look, I'm a public school kid from Portland, Oregon, man. The whole Ivy League world was very new to me.
That's why it was lodged in my brain. I remember you reading about, or I remember reading you talk about, it must've been in an interview about kind of that culture shock. Were you having to do like work study to pay for it and stuff like that?
Yeah, I was, obviously just a different set of circumstances than a lot of people went there. In the end, it was a great experience, but, I was young for my grade. So I showed up there, 17 years old, quite precocious, big personality, but it was just, I'd never seen anything like that, that level of, sort of higher education and the campus and just doing, these kids coming from these prestigious prep schools and stuff like that. It was a different kind of place for me, to adapt to. But, in the end, I'm grateful that I was able to get that education.
Okay. So I don't actually want to gloss over that. Maybe it's my bias that I've developed from doing a lot of therapy, but I always feel like the most important seeds get planted when we're younger, that have the most impact on who we are today. So I'm going to probe that a little bit. If I could, tell me more about being that kid from Portland showing up on the campus at Yale, underage, maybe under. How'd you feel? I don't want to tell you how you felt. You tell me, how did it feel to be that person emerging into that world at that time?
Yeah, I think that, even if you go back even a little bit further, I grew up in this neighborhood in Portland, Southeast Portland, which is now quite a desirable place to live. But when I was growing up in the 90s, it was kind of thought to be the wrong side of the tracks.
Okay.
Not like terribly dangerous or anything like that, but, it was a lower income working class neighborhood. And in Portland at the time, you could actually transfer schools in the public school system still to go to different high schools that had different specialties. And I ended up transferring into the high school on the quote unquote, the right side of the track. So I definitely have this sort of theme throughout my life, both in high school and then certainly into college, as you mentioned, as sort of being the outsider, the other, the kid that, didn't have as many resources, didn't have the leg up. And the way that manifested for me and perhaps potentially, if we're going to a therapy session here right now, we go all the way deep, it's that, I think that put a chip on my shoulder a little bit, a desire to continue to prove myself. And like I said, some people in that environment could, sort of be more shy or withdrawn and not feel like they fit in. Like me, my personality was the opposite. It was like a larger than life personality, kind of covering up my insecurities, to be honest. Yeah. If I'm honest about it now with a little bit more wisdom of just like, I know everything, I'd show up at Yale, I'm precocious, this is how it is where I'm from, this kind of thing. I remember actually, I got into a fist fight about a week of college with a lacrosse player because I'd never even heard of the sport of lacrosse, but at Yale, it's like, oh, I'm on the Yale lacrosse team. It's like a, big deal. And obviously now I've learned to have respect for that. And lacrosse has spread to the West Coast. But again, in the 90s, no one was playing lacrosse on the West Coast. Just like wasn't a thing. And, but I wasn't willing to back down from that, even though this guy was way bigger than me, probably way tougher than me, this kind of thing. I was just like skinny little swimmer, 17-year-old kid. I was like, oh, what? Like, and it was just a little bit of that. But I mean, in the end, like I said, it's funny to laugh about some of this like childhood stuff. But I think that did have some sort of, impact on me. Absolutely. Like all things do. But also I think it, planted some seeds of growth, of saying like, okay, like I grew up in this way. I end up at this school. That wasn't necessarily on my quote unquote, like life trajectory. But it also, one of the things that I think was extremely valuable for me was at that time, most of my friends were taking jobs, that graduated 2006 from Yale economics degree, was iBanking, consulting, prestigious law schools, things like that, because that had been the pipeline of life that they had sort of been mapped out for them before that. I didn't have that mold either. And so I said, I haven't seen anything of the world. I was painting a house in the summer to save up some money. And I said, I'm going to go travel around the world on a shoestring budget. My classmates, they were like, are you crazy? You could get a real job, start your career, whatever. And it's funny, again, this is 20 years ago now. My classmates are like, oh man, I wish I would have taken that gap year off. I wish I could have traveled a little bit. Yeah. I didn't need to get right into my career that way. And so that trip around the world was super formative for me and kind of led me to where I am now. I mentioned it briefly in the intro, which was great experience traveling around the world on a shoestring budget, met my wife on that trip, but ultimately had some tragedy befall me when I was on a beach in rural Thailand, decided to jump a flaming jump rope and ultimately lit my entire body on fire, where I spent several months in the Thai hospital being told I would never walk again normally.
Wow. Okay. So we're definitely going to talk about the fire. But it's so interesting. I try not to like come into these conversations with an agenda, but I am who I am. And my agenda is, baked into the title of this book, of this podcast and my book, right? Unlocking Human Potential. And we already nailed it. Like I'm not going to say let's end the interview, but like, you're right. 20 years of hindsight later, the bankers wish they had taken the time to try the unbeaten path. Yeah. Not the plan, not somebody else's plan for their life, but at least go out and seek their own, whether they found it or not, whether it was better or worse or not, at least it would have been theirs.
Right.
And yours has been yours, is what I'm hearing.
Totally. And look, I have an entrepreneurial spirit. So in a very, very roundabout way, I have now arrived at a place where, I've had a really lucrative and successful career path. I think I probably equaled, if not surpassed, some of my banker friends, but it took me 10 years of living on a shoestring budget and living out of youth hostels and traveling around the world and being a dirtbag climber and a triathlete and things like that to get there. And it's always for me, my North Star is exactly what you said, this sort of drive to continue that to be my path. But it wasn't just in graduating from college where I felt that pressure. There was, okay, after you travel for a year, you burn yourself in a fire. It's like, great. So you're going to get, it's time to get your real job. Or, a few years later into, different twists and turns in my career path and things that I pursued, or these adventures, or, professional sport and triathlon. People are like, okay, you did that. You're 25 now, but like, it's time to, there's a lot of pull back to that. And when I say that career path, that's a great career path for some people. It's not that I'm saying every person doing that is an idiot. It's just that it wasn't for me. Like that, like when I really sat with myself, that wasn't my path. My newest book, The 12-Hour Walk, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about, I open with a story in that book. I won't share all the details, but the long story short is I was invited to give a speech to a bunch of bankers, 500, Wall Street guys. But the night before, I was invited to this small intimate dinner at a big Manhattan penthouse. There's only 8 guys there. And it was, some of the top hedge fund managers in the world, top, bank CEOs, billionaire guys, very successful, but all in their kind of like mid 60s to late 70s, kind of an older crowd. And it's an interesting moment for me, having this conversation with these guys. They're all asking about my adventures. Did you see any dead bodies when you were climbing Everest? What was it like to be alone in Antarctica for 54 days? Really engaged in that. And Everest had been my childhood dream. It's what I dreamed about since I was a little kid. I never knew how I was going to get there, but I was always like, just in my imagination, like, oh, wow, wouldn't that be cool one day? And it took me to be able till I was 31 years old to reach that summit. And fortunately, I've climbed it twice now. But anyways, a question that I love asking people, it's a question I ask elementary school students with my nonprofit work. It's a question I ask people in my public speeches and my books and things like that. I said to these guys, I was like, so I wanted to climb Everest when I was a kid, but what's your guys' Everest? What was your Everest? And I expected these guys, these, super, quote unquote, financially successful guys to be like, oh, well, my Everest was to do this and make all this money. And like, look who I am, whatever, kind of with that bravado and gravitas that I expected. But instead the room falls silent. Like the room just falls silent. And I'm like, it's like when you say some awkward thing and you're like, oh, what? I just got awkward all of a sudden. Right. Crickets, and so the dinner table conversation kind of rambles on, someone breaks the silence and we move on from it, but no one ever kind of broaches that subject again. I was like, oh, I did that. That was weird. I'm getting ready to go and take the elevator down. And a guy from the dinner pulls up beside me, and it's probably the oldest guy in the room, 80s years old or something like that, late 70s, grabs me by the shoulder. And he's like, hey, Colin, can I talk to you for a second before you leave? And I said, yeah, sure. What's going on? And he starts getting emotional. And he says, hey, I'm sorry about my friends back there. You asked us a very reasonable and relevant question. And he goes, and he kind of offers some regret. And he goes, I've made more money than you could ever dream possible. But there's not a day that I don't go back in my life to that pond in summer camp when I was 12 years old on a rowboat, and the simplicity and the stillness of that. And then he goes, I wonder what would have happened in my life had I had the gumption to ask myself that question, what my Everest is, not what somebody else's Everest is, not what the societal norms are, but what my Everest actually was. And he just left it there. Basically, offering a significant amount of regret. And I opened my new book, The 12-Hour Walk, with that story, because I think that question is so potent and so powerful. And I think I know all the entrepreneurs listening to this can probably agree, people that have the creativity and the gumption to create something new, something different, something that's never been created before, or at least asking that question. And it's a question that I think it's important to ask throughout life. But to your point, there's no right answer to that question. It can be making millions of dollars. That could be the answer for you. It could be saving millions of lives. It could be starting that business. It could be leaning into your relationships with your family, your friends, your colleague. It doesn't matter what the answer is, but it's actually, you got to ask yourself that question and be true to yourself in the answer.
Yeah, man. I think I'm probably more, I feel awkwardly moved by soliloquies like that, because it's so true to what I believe. And it's why I do the show. I agree there's no right or wrong answer to that question, but there is absolutely a right or wrong person to answer that question. And I think that as human beings, we are wired for purpose.
Yeah.
We are intentional. We don't walk around, just like through, live a life of happenstance and chaos based on like math equations. Like we're up to something. But is it our thing or is it someone else's thing?
Right.
And if somebody's like, well, I'm not clear on what my thing is, then I guarantee you're living someone else's thing.
Totally. And I get that. So when I ask that question to people, some people say, I have the answer, but I'm not doing it. And then that gets into a conversation about how to sort of reorient and make some shifts or pivots in one's life. But there is a big group of people that ask, they're like, well, what if I don't know what my Everest is? That question. And to your point, they're doing something with their time, right? Which means they got on some train track or some track that was supposed to be the thing they should do. And then literally got so busy doing it that they're not even aware of the fact they're not doing their thing. They're like, but I don't even know what my thing is. Right. And so the 12-hour walk, the book itself, it's about mindset. It's about limiting beliefs. It's about overcoming those fears. And ultimately it's a call to action that invites people to take a 12-hour walk, turn off your phone, put it on airplane mode, go for a walk by yourself in the stillness and silence, and take a day to integrate that. And there's more to that methodology we could talk about if you want, but I bring it into this point of the conversation, which is to say, I tell people if they don't think they know what their Everest is, then use this time to check in with yourself. Use this day of silence and stillness in your own brain to just ask yourself this question. If I don't know what my Everest is, my intention for taking this walk is to discover that. And it's amazing how few people ever take a day or even an hour, or even 30 minutes to actually sit and intentionally think about them. We've got these, and I'm guilty of this too, cell phones in our pockets, buzzing, to-do list, got to take the kids here, got to take this email, this Zoom call, whatever. And we can be busy, man. You could take your first job when you're 22 years old and be busy until you're 65 years old and wake up and be like, wait, what happened? Like, you did a bunch of stuff, but were you intentional about your time and your actual purpose in that period of time? And it's amazing how just taking one day to have a reflection or an inflection point, how powerful that can be, which is why I'm so excited about spreading this mission around the 12-hour walk.
Well, I love the idea of the 12-hour walk. My therapist, it's probably been a decade now, told me to go sit on a rock for 4 hours. With the same thing, no phone. And since then I've done that. I haven't done 54 days, but I've done self-selected intervals of solitude. In fact, last month I did a 24-hour inside a 10 by 10 square, just in the woods, just by myself.
How was it?
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, I was a professional jazz musician. So I used to practice 12, 14 hours a day by myself, trying to find myself through sound. Mm-hmm. So I've developed a really deep, pretty loving relationship with myself in solitude. Music was my Everest for a long time. I had sort of a standard of how I wanted to be able to execute at an instrument. And I think your Everest can change. And that actually maybe I have so much more to say about everything. You've given me like some of the most fertile ground to farm here for a bit, but I don't want to get stuck in it. So maybe the next question then is like, okay, so Everest was your Everest. Mm-hmm. Well, you've Everested twice. Everest is now a verb, by the way. So what's your Everest now?
It's a great question. I remember, when I summited Everest the first time in 2016, it was part of this project that's called the Explorers Grand Slam. So that's to climb the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents, the 7 summits, as well as complete expeditions to both the North and South Pole. And at that time, about fewer than 50 people had ever completed the Explorers Grand Slam. But I was aiming to be not just complete it, but to be the fastest to ever complete it. And so I set my sights on the world record, which at the time was around 6 months. And I ended up doing that in around 4 months, 139 days consecutively for all 9 of those expeditions all around the world in every single continent, just back to back to back to back. And Everest being the second to last in the world.
How many days did you say?
It was 139 days total.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question, but continue.
Yeah. So, summiting Everest was amazing. And then right after that, I summited Denali, which made the moment where I actually ended up being 2 world records for the 7 summit speed record by itself, and then the Explorers Grand Slam. And, got my first sort of level of public recognition around my expeditions. These are my first 2 world records, et cetera. And I went around, sharing the story because I think it's really powerful to be able to share stories. Particularly, I had a nonprofit. I still have a nonprofit, but I'd started it that year around inspiring young people to get outside, move their bodies, live active, healthy lives, and really around aspirational goal setting. And so I started asking these students that question. And it's beautiful because students, I have a concept that I really strongly believe in. It's a core concept of my new book, The 12-Hour Walk, called a possible mindset. And I define that as an empowered way of thinking that unlocks life of limitless possibilities, just daring to dream greatly. It's the mindset that I had in that hospital room in Thailand when the doctor said you may never walk normally again. And you mentioned it in the interview. It was like, oh, I'm going to walk normally again, but I'm also going to race a triathlon. I'm also going to, continue to set big goals. And obviously there was a lot of iteration, but even just the belief in that hospital room that I could do something beyond what I was being told, right? These limitless possibilities. You ask these students these questions, and it's fun. You ask 8, 9, 10-year-olds this question. And 500 students in a gymnasium at an assembly in elementary school or something like that, 500 hands go up in the air, man. It's amazing. You ask kids this question and they all have an answer. And their answers are dreams, big dreams without limits. And of course, we've heard the cliche, I want to be an astronaut, or, I've heard thousands of answers, to this question. I want to be the heartfelt ones. I want to be the first person in my family to graduate from college, things like that. And two things happened for me during that period of time. One is, although I was asking people this question and I had just climbed Mount Everest, my childhood dream, I realized I was 31 years old at the time. Like I've got many more mountains to climb, both literally and figuratively. And so I wasn't just going to kick my feet up and do nothing for the rest of my life. I actually had to say to myself, well, what is my next Everest? And we'll talk about it, I'm sure. But that is when I formulated the idea for becoming the first person to cross Antarctica solo. So that was my next Everest. But I continue to ask myself that question on the backside of each one of these expeditions. And honestly, right now I've got some other expeditions. I haven't announced them that I'm cooking up in my mind, but I'm also really passionate about this 12-hour walk idea. I write the last sentence of the book says, my next Everest has actually inspired 10 million people to take the 12-hour walk. And look, it's free. You can just right at your front door. But I believe the impact that we can have on each other, and the more people that can take just one day to themselves to walk in their own stillness and silence, I believe that the ripple effect of positivity of that is vast. But the second thing, and I think you'll appreciate this, the second thing that happened during that time is I wasn't just speaking to elementary school kids, speaking to high school kids, speaking to college kids. And then, as I mentioned before, speaking to, business leaders and adults in professional contexts. Every age group that I went higher. So elementary school kid, 500 kids around. High school kids, I'm lucky if half of them put their hands up. College kids, maybe a third. You start asking, mid-level management at a corporation somewhere, average age 40. I'm lucky if I get 2 hands in the back of the room up where someone's willing to share with me what their Everest is. Again, I sort of reflective of what, the crickets of this room that I described before. And why is that? Why is that? My thesis, and I've certainly spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this, is we're actually born with a possible mindset. This thing that I teach, this empowered way of thinking, this limitless belief in limitless possibilities. We're born with that. But society, unfortunately, and the sort of societal norms and the pressures and the setbacks and the growing fear and anxiety and, the dinging of our phones actually trains that out of us. And so this 12-hour walk, and so much of my own mission, inspiring others, is around getting people to tap back in, to say, I'm not actually teaching you about something you don't know about. I'm just reteaching you. I'm refamiliarizing you with something that you were innately came into this planet with, which is there are limitless possibilities in front of us on every step of the way.
Yeah, I love it. And it's so as soon as you were describing that room, I thought, okay, there's 3 reasons, because I feel like in a lot of ways we have a commonality. I'm very actively in my life and my work trying to solve for helping people rediscover their willingness to dream and then operationalize it based on the advantages of being a grown up, which is like, we actually know how the world works and we've developed some skills, and theoretically we should be in a better position to go after our dreams than we were when we were a kid. But yet we seem to have drifted further away from even looking at them. Right.
Right. Totally.
It should be easier now that you're an adult, so you can travel without your parents and you have some money theoretically. And speak the language and whatever. But anyway, right. So why would the room go silent? And it's gotta be one of 3 things. Either they've forgotten, they've literally lost it. To your point, such that it's still rediscoverable, or they feel shame. Right. That they haven't pursued it, or they're embarrassed to say it in front of their peers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably a combination of all three, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the third one I think is big. There's a whole chapter in the book around the fear of others, or, the fear of criticism, right? The fear of not acceptance. And it's so interesting that we live in a society where we can, even fear, some of our best friends, our family members. Oh, I want to say this goal, but they're going to say,
to be clear, I think we fear them the most,
right? And I know there's a lot of entrepreneurs listening to this. It's like, some people are such dedicated entrepreneurs that they're like, this is my big idea, I'm going for it, whatever. And obviously if you started the business, you did, but there's probably that moment when you had to tell your mother, your father, your best friend, or someone like that. And almost every good entrepreneur that I know, successful people I know, hundreds of millions of dollars, huge exits, whatever. They're like, I'll tell you what, when I told my best friend or my mom this idea when I was launching it, people were like, that is a stupid idea. Like, that's never going to work. Like sometimes the people closest to us. And I say, I'm a big believer that we are the stories that we tell ourselves. We're the stories we tell ourselves, right? Like, we get to choose. You don't let somebody else write that story for you. And if you dare to dream greatly, if you dare to set that seemingly impossible goal, I'll tell you what, I'd barely spend any time in Antarctica, and I announced to the world and my friends and my peers, hey, I'm going to become the first person in history to walk across the entire continent of Antarctica solo, unsupported, and human powered. And people were like, what are you talking about, man? You're crazy. And then people looked into it further and they go, wait a second. People have actually tried this before. Really, really talented polar explorers have tried this before. People have died. People have run out of food. And you're like fairly inexperienced. Like, not only like, is this thing impossible, but if there were somebody to do it, it sure as hell isn't you, Colin. Like, you're a triathlete and you've climbed some mountains, but like, you're not like some hardened, lifelong polar explorer. And had I let them author my story, I would have been like, you're right, guys. You're right. There's no way I'm going to do this. But you have to have that sort of inner strength to push back against that. I mean, the same thing, I won't go on too long of a rant here about this, but passionate about it. It's like when I set my goal for that first expedition, I mentioned the Explorers Grand Slam and I mentioned the outcome. I did it in 139 days. When I dreamed that up, I had no money. I had $10,000 to my name. My wife and I were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon. And we quickly did some research on the project, and just the logistics, the North Pole, the South Pole, Everest, the whole project was going to cost somewhere around $500,000. And that's the moment, like, I'm telling you what, that is the moment where most good ideas die. You're like, hey, I got this big idea for this thing, or I want to launch this new company. It's going to be this, that, and the other thing. And then you wake up and you're like, oh, but I've got no money, no resources, no way to figure this out. Like, or even a more silly example, it's like you're drinking beers with a buddy on the weekend. You're like, yo, we're going to train for the New York City Marathon, and we're going to run this marathon. You wake up with a hangover the next day and you're like, yeah, man, like, I'm just bullshitting with you, right? Why? Because our own thoughts degrade our mind. We are sometimes our harshest critics, and that fear of failure, that fear of actually not getting there, that's what leaves us short of unlocking our fullest potential, like you talk about, right? And it's being able to push through that, to reorient that mindset, makes all of the difference. And again, I won't give the story, but there's a whole 18 months between when I said I want to do this thing for $500,000 and the thousands of doors that got slammed in my face and the dead ends and the things. But I got up every single day being like, I have no idea how I'm going to solve this thing, but I believe in abundance. I believe in the limitless possibilities that exist. I believe my truest potential is figuring this out. And I did. And here I am.
I got off a call with a friend of mine this morning who, he's really a friend. I actually, at the end, I said, dude, how much do I owe you? Because it was basically an hour consulting session with a friend. Those happen sometimes when you have cool, smart friends. And he was like teaching me some stuff that's really helpful for me. But one of the things he actually, when I literally asked him, I was like, dude, how much do you normally charge for an hour consulting? Cause I'm like, I feel guilty. Like, I don't want to abuse our friendship just cause you happen to know things that I'm interested in. And, he said, don't worry, we're even, because you've been helping a really good friend of mine and you didn't even know it. And I was like, oh, tell me what you mean. And it turned, anyway, long story short, he has a friend who's been following my stuff and he's gone through my program. And he said, he's still in your program and he's this and that. But the one thing, he's like, I've known this guy for years. And the one thing that he's taken away from you and your program that I have seen him completely transform his life with in the last, it was like 9 months or something, is waking up every day and taking consistent action, even if you're not clear of exactly where it's taking you.
Yep.
And he said, in 9 months, I've seen this guy do more than he'd done in the last 5 years because I'm his friend and I see his life. And it's kind of like you said. And I'm hoping everybody's extrapolating from this conversation that we're having. Like, it doesn't mean that you have to go do the Explorer Grand Slam, and it doesn't mean your number has to be $500,000. The point is, wake up every day and go after the thing that you've set your sights on, irregardless of what the peanut gallery has to say about it. And even if you don't know how it's going to happen, it's not going to happen if you don't wake up every day and go after it. But also, it's really damn possible that it might happen.
Totally. And, people always, and I love telling the story, sure, of the big expeditions and the big epic moments in those expeditions and things like that. But when I summited Everest for the first time, 2016, I looked down and I 31 years in the dreaming, I'm 31 years old. I don't know when exactly I first heard about Everest, but it was definitely elementary school age. I was young, read some book or saw some, in school film or something about, Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world. And my imagination was hooked from that point onwards. And I had no idea how I was going to get there. And I get to the summit. It's this beautiful moment, of celebration. You can only be on the summit for 5 minutes, and you got to get down there, sit down safely. I look down and there's, some ice, some rocks, and there's a couple of pebbles there on the ground. And I reach down, I pick up this pebble and I put it in my pocket, and I've carried it with me for years ever since. And, it's a tiny little rock, you couldn't distinguish it from the, a little rock in your driveway or something like that. But what struck me in that moment, and the reason I carry that around me, is exactly what you're talking about, is that Mount Everest, literally the largest mountain in the world. I can tell you from experience, when you stand at the bottom of that mountain, you look up at that, you think to yourself, there is no possible human way anyone could ever climb all the way up there. It's just so massive, right? And that's how our goals and our hopes and our dreams and things often feel, just so insurmountable. But I didn't get up there by doing some Herculean thing once. The rock in my pocket reminds me that even Mount Everest, even the tallest mountain in the world, can be broken down to its smallest parts. It's actually just a bunch of small little rocks stacked on top of each other, thousands, if not millions of steps leading to the summit. And I realized that my journey to get there wasn't just the journey on the mountain, just the steps actually taken on the mountain, but it was the dreaming, it was the preparing, it was that consistency over time, that diligence, the setting the big goal of the Explorers Grand Slam, the working towards, the $500,000, the training my body, whatever. But none of those gains were actually made overnight. Those gains were made by, like you said, getting up, sending one more email, making one more phone call, lifting one more rep of the weight. Those tiny, 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 smallest little rocks stacked on top of each other. That is how you reach the summit of your Everest. And I think your advice is, and your story about your friend, it couldn't be more true, in my opinion, for sure. That's what it's about, consistency over time.
Yeah. And if I've learned anything from talking to a lot of really elite performers, which I'm blessed to have done in large part because of this podcast, but also because I've always sought them out. Even when I was a piano player, I was a professional piano player in my 20s. And I had some gigs where I would play in the homes of billionaires, and on breaks, all the my fellow band members would go to they actually had servants' kitchens. They had separate kitchens where it was like Downton Abbey, if you've ever seen that. They had separate hallways and separate kitchens. Sure. They would go to the service kitchens, not servants' kitchens. I think I just put my foot in my mouth. But they would go in there and hang out with the caterers and, talk to the help. And I would be out on the floor, totally way out of my element, probably inappropriate, trying to mingle with billionaires to be yo, how'd you do it? What can I learn from these guys? Right. And all my life, I've been drawn to, outlier performers and great successes. And what I found is the commonality is just this ability to concentrate on and stack small accomplishments in long succession. I interviewed James Lawrence, the guy that has the world record for, you probably know who that is.
Ironman. Iron Cowboy.
Yeah, the Iron Cowboy. Yeah, he's a friend of mine. And he said, he's and for the audience, if you haven't heard that conversation, he ran 100 triathlons in 100 days.
Yeah, Ironman triathlons. Yeah, it's crazy.
Ironman triathlons. Wow. Yeah, to be clear. And he also ran 50 Ironman triathlons in 50 states in 50 days at separate times. So, but anyway, and he said, dude, he goes, when he was in the middle of the 100 triathlons, he was like, I have 14,000 miles to go of biking, swimming, and running. He's like, that's inconceivable. But what I could always do was take a perfect step. Mm-hmm. And then I could take another one. And then he's like, I can be perfect 3 feet at a time. But being perfect for 14,000 miles, that was too much to digest. So I just thought about the next step the whole time.
100%.
Oh, it's so good, man. So okay. And I don't want you to give away what's in your book. Actually, I told you earlier, I'm in a non sequitur here. I said, hey, I got a follow-up question about 139 days.
Let's go back.
Do you know, and if so, you're as weird as I am for wanting to know, how many calories did you eat in those 139 days?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Will you please go do the math? I just want to know.
The closest answer I could get to you on that is I did a lot more deep dive into my specific nutrition and food around the Antarctica, solo Antarctica crossing. And the reason why is I was trying to do something called unsupported, which is what I did. Which means no resupplies of food or fuel at all along the way, which means whatever you get dropped off with on the edge of Antarctica, that's all you've got. You can't call in resupplies. You can't bring in an extra, 100 pounds of food halfway through or something like that.
Right.
So the reason that expedition had never been completed was for this exact reason. It's not that people couldn't stay out there for, 60 days, 70 days, whatever, in my case, 54 days. It was because if you put 1,000 pounds of food in a sled, you can't move it. But if you put 100 pounds of food in a sled, you can move it, but you're going to run out of food, before you get to the other side. And so I did all this research on optimizing the food and the nutrition, everything in my sled. What came down to and how much I could pull. First and foremost, my sled started out weighing 375 pounds.
And water too. I mean, water.
So you put fuel, white gas in there to melt. You're surrounded by water.
Okay.
So but you have to have fuel, of course. So the fuel is also weight in there. So it's food and fuel. But you're obviously, if you carry that much water, you definitely wouldn't get anywhere because it'd be frozen. It'd be big block ice.
I'm tempted to ask the editors to cut out that question. I just asked about water. But,
you'd be surprised. So many people ask that question. So many people, they're like, wait, but what about water? They're like, oh, right. Of course. It's literally, that's all you're walking on is water. It's frozen water. But that's what takes a lot of effort. I was drinking 6 liters of water per day because I'm burning so many calories and working so hard, and it's a large desert. So it takes me about 2 or 3 hours to melt 6 liters of water in that temperature, right? So it's a lot of effort and a lot of fuel that you need per weight of that. Anyways, but so I was burning 10,000 calories a day is what we estimated. And I could only put in my sled enough for 7,000 calories per day for 55 days. And I, towards the last 15 days, was running so low on food and supplies that I actually reduced that to 5,000. So basically from day one, I was on a 3,000 calorie deficit. And then on the last, couple of weeks, I was on as much as a 5,000 plus calorie deficit while I was out there, which sounds like you know a lot about food and nutrition. You can quickly do the math. You're losing a pound a day of body weight.
Almost a pound and a half.
Yeah. So I was a bag of bones on the other side. That's for sure.
Yeah. And I assume you're not self-conscious about it. Like what are your stats? How tall, how much do you weigh? Do you know your lean body mass or body fat? Like now you got me into this.
I'm 6 foot tall. One of the funniest comments that I get from people is I'll go give a speech, whatever, on a stage somewhere, and someone comes up to me afterwards. They're like, "Hey man, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I read your bio," and they're kind of being all shy, and they're like, well, you're just like a really normal looking guy. Right. Like they're like, I read your bio. I figured like 6'6", like huge jack, like dude, like I'm like a pretty like normal size guy. I mean, 6 foot tall. I mean, I'm not, that's not super tall, not super short, 6 foot tall. When I was racing triathlon professionally, I raced as light as like 155, 150. My walking around weight right now is about 170. When I started my Antarctica crossing, obviously I knew I was going to lose a ton of weight. So I actually intentionally, gain lean muscle mass, but ultimately the last month or two, I actually tried to properly put on fat. In my memoir, The Impossible First, there's some pictures of that. I got up to like high 180s, 185, 188, something like that. And then when I finished, I didn't get a scale on me like right away before I ate a bunch of food when I got back to the space in Antarctica, but I estimated that I lost, anywhere between 30 to 40, 50 pounds. I was skinny. Like my wife didn't recognize me.
So you were like potentially like 140.
Yeah. Something. Yeah. I would always estimate somewhere in like the high 140s probably. I mean, I was just like, here's something I never know could happen. This is how I know I lost a lot of weight. And I had a wristwatch on the entire time, obviously, never took it off. And one day maybe day 40 or something like that. I know my ribs are sticking out. My hip bones are sticking out. It's getting uncomfortable to sleep. I'm having to actually sew and stitch my pants because I'm getting so skinny that my pants are starting to fall off of me. making them tighter and tighter. And then I raised my left hand, which has my wristwatch on it at one point, and my wristwatch slides back towards my elbow. Oh. And I think to myself, I'm like, oh, weird. I must have somehow loosened the strap like in the night. And I look down and sure enough, I haven't loosened the strap at all. It's that I'm actually losing so much weight that now my body is it's actually eating the excess fat in my wrist. It's not a place that it's like my body is in such starvation mode that you never think I could lose my, forearm a little bit.
Yeah. Wow.
And so that's the level of intense starvation my body was going through that expedition.
So there's a guy here locally. I live in St. George, Utah. Steve Cook is his name. He's a fitness YouTuber. Cool. And I remember I know him loosely, but I've seen him. And I remember one day he was on this big quest to prove, he was I'm trying to illustrate how many, how much, there's people that'll stuff their face with 2,000 or 3,000 calories at a time. And he's I'm trying to illustrate how many calories people really eat mindlessly. Mm-hmm. And so he was trying to burn 10,000 calories in a day, and he eventually abandoned it. And so what I'm hearing is you have to go to Antarctica with a 300-pound sled and walk all day dragging it to hit that number. Figured out how to burn 10,000 calories a day.
That's about the limit. So to ratchet that up a little bit, I'm pulling that sled 12 hours a day. In Antarctica, you basically can't take breaks. I would take a 60 to 90 second break ever to drink some water, eat some food. But at minus 30 degrees, you can stay warm if you're moving, but it is so cold, particularly with wind chill. It'd be 30, 40, 50 mile per hour wind sometimes, minus 60 wind chill. You stand still for 2 minutes, you're shivering. You stand still for 10 minutes, you're hypothermic and frostbitten if there's any exposed skin. So it's 12 hours of constant motion. And then on top of that, it took me about 2 hours to break down my camp every single morning and about 3 hours at night to melt all the water, do chores, sew stuff, whatever. So I had about 12 hours a day of pulling my sled and another 5 hours of chores, and your body is in this extreme environment. So that all of those things combined is how you can get to 10,000, but it is nearly impossible. Well,
and you're also just your basal metabolic rate is probably doubled because you just have to stay warm. Your body's just
you're trying to just
thermogenically kick it up.
Stay warm. Yeah. And that in itself is, burning thousands of calories.
Okay. So you just spoke my love language, not to make this weird, but that intense, consistent focus. You said it was 54 days?
Yeah.
54 days, every day, couple hours of breaking down camp, constant movement, 3 hours of producing water for yourself, 12 hours of pulling a heavy sled, make camp, stay warm, rinse, wash, repeat 54 times.
Yep.
Don't go crazy. Mm-hmm. Don't kill yourself.
Yep.
Don't stop. Talk to me about that. Take me into the deepest tunnel that you found in your own mind during that time. Yeah.
So, I've had a longstanding meditation practice. I've done, a bunch of these 10-day silent meditation retreats called Vipassana. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I've heard of them. I've never done one.
Highly recommend. Powerful, challenging. Well, I found through that practice, I started doing that long before I even thought about crossing Antarctica. But looking back, it's that was, amazing, pre-training. And what I found in that stillness and the silence is our default response is to distract ourselves, right? It's to say oh, let's listen to music, listen to podcasts. I love music. I love podcasts. I like dance. I love all that kind of stuff. Totally. But what I realized, or my thesis anyways, was when leading Antarctica was, you tapped right into it, which is the success of this project was actually about, can you figure out a 17-hour day and then do it again exactly like that? And again, can you carbon copy it over and over and over and over again? Because consistency was the name of the game.
Yeah.
I realized one of the things I did is I deleted almost all my music and podcasts because I thought on the first few days, my mind is going to really want something like that. It's going to want to grasp onto that. And this as a musician, but your mind can actually keep time signatures on music and things like that. It's oh, that song's 4 minutes long. This podcast was an hour. This is whatever. But if you can actually get yourself into these flow states, these deeper inner workings of your brain, you actually can get into this sort of timeless space in your mind. And don't get me wrong, there were some hours out there that felt like days because they were so intense and so harsh and so dangerous and all the things. But I also got to a place in my mind where there was days, literal days that went by that felt like a few hours. because I got to a point, and of course it took, several days to find this rhythm where those 54 days that, like, let's call them the last 40 days, those 54 days when I was really in rhythm, I did the exact same thing. What I mean is my alarm would go off at 5:30. I would take my right hand, I would put it into my left coat pocket and pull up my chapstick, put my chapstick on with my left hand. I would reach my matches. I would turn my stove on, reach the match. I would take my right sock and put my right sock on first, my left sock on first. It was just like rhythmic on autopilot. And in some way, of course, that can sound like the most boring, monotonous thing possible. And there's something to be said for that. But it also was so fluid and freeing, and allowed myself to kind of automate my systems. And so I only had to make one decision every single day rather than 10,000 decisions. The decision was do the next step, repeat. And as you said, don't give up. And obviously there's things that came up that diverted me from that. But the real heart of the success in this was being able to tap into that. And I certainly, as a result of that, went into some very, very, very deep places in my mind that were beautiful and peaceful and fulfilling and scary at times, and the whole range of emotions.
Yeah. So that sounds hyper spiritual and really beautiful to me. So I'm curious, and obviously this wasn't your foray into extreme focus and discipline and sort of sustained intensity like that. But whether it was from that experience or from the aggregate of these types of experiences, how has that perhaps reinformed how you live when you're not in Antarctica, but you're right in the middle of the distraction economy, but more than most people, what else is possible. So how do you cope here?
It's a funny answer. Just answer obviously as genuinely, as candidly as possible, which is some people hear the story or they read my bio or something like that, and they think like, wow, this guy must be like a mega introvert. Like this guy must have really like to sit alone and just think about his projects, whatever. Like that couldn't be further from the truth. Like I'm a mega extrovert. I love to party. I love to dance. I love to hang out with people. I got 5 older sisters. I got a big family. I'm usually really, very social, very, very social. But it has equipped me with sort of the yin to the yang of saying like, I like being social. I like being around people. I like, like I said, I use social media. I haven't tapped into my phone fairly often, but I like how you phrase that. The distraction economy is so true. I also can understand the balance of that. I can understand the need and the desire to reset, the idea to go deep inside of my mind. And so these places, I look at them as springboards, like the Antarctica crossing. I tapped into some of the deepest places around fulfillment, depth, love, joy, compassion. And I can take those experiences with me. I was out there, like I said, pulling the sled 12 hours per day. And that's why the name for the 12-hour walk the book, came from, was these 12 hours. The origin story of the book is, I was able to pull my sled for 12 hours a day. And as my body got weaker and weaker, I lost all that weight, whatever, my mind got stronger and stronger. I actually felt more lit up, more strong, more powerful than ever before towards the end of that project, interestingly enough, as I was in these flow states, in these depths and places in my mind. When I got back, a lot of success on the back of that, financial success or business opportunities that arose out of that, et cetera. I was swept up in the whole thing, right. But I still was able to tap back into that stillness, that silence, that diligence in my daily work and my daily practice until COVID, man. And this is me being very honest and vulnerable, until COVID. And COVID threw me for a loop, just like many of us. All of a sudden, before I know it, everything I got going on is canceled. I'm trapped in my house. Mm-hmm. I'm worried about my parents. I'm reading these headlines. People are dying. People, all that sort of that anxiety, that fear of the uncertainty of those first, month or so. And although I had been able to keep my equilibrium for years on the backside of Antarctica, I kind of lost it in that moment. My wife looks over at me at one point around the Oregon coast, and she says to me, Colin, you haven't gotten off the couch or changed out of your pajamas in 4 days. Are you okay? And I'm there, just looking at the news. Did you see that Italy's closing its borders? Did you see, just sort of wound up. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of us experienced that in that moment of time. It's such a bizarre moment in our collective history. And I kind of said to myself, I said, wow, this is actually your original question. How do I manage that? I was able to tap back in and go, wait, when do I feel the most clean? and calm in my own mind. I said, Jenna, to my wife, I said, Jenna, tomorrow I'm going to go for a walk all day. Don't wait. I'll see you around dinner time. So I wake up that morning, I walk out my front door, and I'm walking for about 20 minutes. My phone buzzes in my pocket like it often does. A friend of mine's texting me, and I reach for my phone, I'm about to text him back. And I'm like, wait a second, like, what am I doing? Like, I've been doom scrolling the news. I've been wound at my exam. Now I'm staring at my phone, distracting myself. I'm on a walk. So I put my phone in airplane mode, put it in my pocket for the rest of the time. And I continue walking for 12 hours. And I take breaks. It's not like I'm like trying to go a certain distance or anything like that, but I'm out there alone, no music, no podcast, engaging in what I had done in Antarctica. And I walk back in my door at the Oregon coast, and my wife looks at me and she goes, "You're back." And I said, "Yeah, I told you I'd come back around dinner time." And she goes, No, you're back. Like your spirit is back.
Yeah. She could feel it.
She could feel it. And she was 100% right. And it was a full reset. So that was, my way of tapping back into that. But I'll be honest, in that moment, I didn't necessarily think, oh God, this is something that has broad applications. I'm like, I'm the guy who walked across Antarctica for 12 hours every single day. Great. Like, I can tap back into that. That's in my toolkit because, I'm Colin, the guy who walked across that. But I started, as we all did, friends, family members, colleagues that were struggling during COVID. I started just telling people about this. I was, oh yeah, man, I did this. And it actually like really changed everything for me during this pandemic, scared time. And people said, I want to do that. I want to take you up on that. Before I knew it, I had dozens of friends in my inner circle, friends, colleagues, and people of all different walks of life. I told people, I don't care how far you go. I don't care if you walk for 1 mile or 50 miles. I don't care how many breaks you take, but commit to the full 12 hours of the stillness and silence inside of yourself. My 77-year-old mother-in-law took me up on it. She did it one time around her block in North Carolina and then sat on her porch, in stillness and silence, and then did another block. My ultra marathon friend, did 45 miles or something like that, right? And neither one of those people were doing the 12-hour walk better or worse than the other. What they all had in common, and now with this book, and ultimately the book, I think of it more as a book than a global movement than just a book. Thousands and thousands of people all around the world have now taken this 12-hour walk, take me up on this suggestion. Several, maybe 30 people in 30 different countries, every single continent, people have done this walk. My goal is to proliferate it to 10 million people. And over and over and over again, everyone's got different things going on in their life, different set of circumstances, but the feedback is positive. Wow, I needed that reset. That was a step outside my comfort zone. I needed to sharpen my mind like that. Yeah, my feet are a little bit tired, but the lessons I've learned from this, I will take with me for the next decade of my life. I needed this reset. I'm more tapped into what my Everest is. I can overcome these limiting beliefs. I thought I didn't have enough money, enough time. I was afraid to fail. I was afraid of this criticism, but this walk has proven to me that I'm stronger beyond measure. And so for me, again, it is free. It's accessible. It's outside your front door. You can go to 12hourwalk.com, and I encourage people to do that just so they can pick a day, because you probably know this from all your work on habit stacking and unlocking potential. It's like when people actually put something on their calendar, they're 90% more likely to actually do it. So it takes you 10 seconds to sign up on my website. And it basically just means I'm going to send you a couple emails and said, hey, Jeff, you signed up on October 19th. That's tomorrow. Make sure you're still doing your 12-hour walk. Just a little bit of accountability. But yeah, man, that 12-hour walk in Antarctica equipped me for that. But one of the beautiful lessons, and concluding this thought here, is that I wouldn't take my own experience in Antarctica back for anything. As my magnum opus of expeditions at this point, it pushed me to all the limits. I learned so much. It was beautiful. But one of the ironic things that I also learned about it was that I can actually access the essence of that. And so can all of us globally, without having to go to Antarctica, without having to raise all the money and fly down there and risk your life, whatever. In the world that is constantly bombarding us with distractions, we actually just need to say, put your phone in airplane mode, make the decision, spend a day alone with yourself. It is as simple, but there's magic and beauty in the simplicity, and it will unlock a massive breakthrough in your life. I promise you.
Well, that's incredible. The book, you said 12hourwalk.com?
Yep.
Yeah. So, how else can people find you and follow you?
I'm on Instagram, just my name at Colin O'Brady. There's also 12-hour walk Instagram, my own website, colinobrady.com. But really for everything 12-hour walk related, check out 12hourwalk.com. Actually also created an app for the 12-hour walk, which basically just puts your phone in airplane mode, but tracks where you walk so you can see how far you went and so you don't get lost out there. And there's some FAQs. People are always like, oh, where'd I go to the bathroom? Or how do I bring food or whatever? So all sorts of those questions are answered on the website. But check it out. Join the global movement. It's already impacting thousands and thousands of people's life around the world, and encourage everyone to try it.
The other thing I'll say, maybe it's a little bit of it's not meant to be a downer, but I think it's meant to be a qualifier. is like, do the 12-hour walk, but in listening to somebody that did 648 hours of walking across 54 days, which is, 12 hours a day, once isn't enough, or once isn't an inoculation, because you did what you did in Antarctica. And just like everybody else, you were still just as susceptible to backsliding. And you found yourself on the couch, not having changed your pajamas for 4 days, right? In other words, I guess, whether it's Antarctica or it's a 12-hour walk, let it be the beginning of creating space in your life for who you really are to start to drive. Not like it's not a vaccine for being distracted every other day for the rest of your life.
No,
I'm good. I took a 12-hour walk.
It's an opening. It's an invitation and an opening, and it's a deep cut that hopefully opens up. And I say it unlocks your best life, because from that, you can take those lessons and start to apply them daily in consistent ways. Right. And so, yeah, man, here to everything you said. It's such a pleasure to sit down with you. Definitely a like-minded kindred spirit. So, man, it's a great pleasure to sit down with you and really admire all the work that you're doing in the world.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
I believe that anybody in their darkest hour can be perfect for 1 second. I have the option to quit, or I have the option to be perfect for 1 second. And if you continue to choose the option to be perfect for 1 second, you cannot lose in life. It's how you win at the highest level.